You could not believe your eyes when you saw the President of the United States get overthrown by the American People's Militia. You thought the President would nuke everything before ever admitting defeat, but he probably had his big red button taken away as a precaution. What a plot twist nonetheless. Boy, you sure are glad that was just a movie. America is totally doing well right now, and everybody is in support of the new administration. After such a thrilling movie-going experience to start driving back home, but oh no, there's a major traffic jam in front of you. Because these pesky city planners didn't add another lane. Instead, they built a public park. Damn commies, what's next? 15-minute walkable cities? You might as well put me in a gulag already, Chairman Trump. Your car is at a standstill, and it looks like you'll be staying here for quite a bit. So you whip out your trusty American iPhone, made in China, and start cycling between your 5 favorite social media apps like you always do. Twitter welcomes you with a peppy speech by Adolf Hitler that has been dubbed over an AI English translation. Adolf shoots lasers out of his eyes as he declares war on Poland, and all of the comments collectively say based, and that Germany should have won. You don't really feel like listening to supreme meat-writing professionals explain to you how fascism is super good, actually, so you go to Reddit instead. There you are met with countless posts of people buying and burning Trump merchandise as a form of passive resistance. Apparently the liberals have organized a peaceful protest against fascism in Washington, D.C., where they wear pink hats and chant "Orange Man Bad," until all Republican leaders split themselves in two like Rumpelstiltskin. Every single comment is about how America has now become the enemy like China and Russia, and must be defeated by the Reddit nation. Why can't I just look at some memes or something interesting on my homepage? You think to yourself? So you go on Instagram to look at some memes, but for some reason, these Save Europe edits keep appearing in your feed, even though you don't watch them. You start to notice that the algorithms have been especially divisive lately. People are at each other's throats and bots keep instigating conflict when they can. No matter what platform you use, none of them are safe from these divide and conquer tactics. You know that this isn't a coincidence. Somebody is trying to divide the population on purpose, but who's behind it? How can you stop it? And what's their end goal? Suddenly, you notice that your phone has been sharing your location with someone this entire time. Quick, you need to tell everybody the truth about what's going on right now, but as soon as you attempt to step out of your car to run away, you're shot by a police officer. Sadly, those 18 bullets did a number on you. But the cop didn't shoot you because you knew too much. It was because you looked like a black person through his sunglasses. Propaganda. Information, especially of a biased, misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. That's how Oxford Dictionary defines propaganda, and you might have realized that if this is the definition, then it really is everywhere. Disclaimer. I did try to make this video as undivisive as possible, but due to the nature of the topic at hand, I have to admit that this video is propaganda as well, in a way. But at least it's not state-sponsored, that's for sure. A common misconception is that propaganda has to come from the government to be legitimate, or it has to be related to the military, but it doesn't. Fake news, grifters, and engagement baiters, they could all be participating in mass public propaganda. But how have we come to this, and why is it still so effective, even though we're supposed to have the truth readily available at our fingertips? The short answer is money, most of the time. They're playing a game of which heartstrings do we pull to get the biggest amount of people to support our cause. But this time, money is only part of the answer. While a lot of us have been falling into this doom spiral of seeing terrible information, thinking it's over, only for it to be far from over, a war has been waging across many different lands and continents. Probably the longest ongoing war of the 21st century. An information war. A cyber war. Propaganda has been historically used to influence the public's collective consciousness, through movies, the television, and the news. Most media that could have propaganda hidden in it probably did, but the big difference between the 20th and 21st century is that a huge chunk of our lives go into these information devices, so we're more exposed to propaganda as a whole, even that of different countries. If you lived in the US during the Red Scare, it was basically impossible to find any propaganda that promoted socialism and communism, but the internet has changed the game. The United States of America used to be the dominant force when it came to global media. They had their country on lockdown. When they announced the war on terror, millions of Americans cheered it on and supported their troops, even though the justification for the war was completely unrelated to the country of Iraq. September 11th, 2001 is a date that most Americans are supposed to never forget, and while it was a tragedy, it had nothing to do with Iraq in any capacity. Oh, and we only know this information, by the way, because somehow the passports of the perpetrators survived the giant plane explosion that disintegrated the plane and the steel beams supporting the towers. Man, they must make those passports super tough, huh? And the fact that the terrorists used their real, verifiable passports instead of fake ones. The whole story is just very convenient, to say the least. Of course, I'm not saying that it was orchestrated, but you have to admit, there are a lot of convenient details around the attacks. Like Donald Rumsfeld admitting on September 10th that the Pentagon could not account for $2.3 trillion in transactions, thus facing an audit on September 11th, and it just so happens that the section of the building responsible for tax and spending related documents was destroyed by the plane. But let's ignore the cushiness of 9/11 for a bit, because even if the whole story is completely accurate and Al-Qaeda launched a massive attack against the American people, why invade Iraq over this? The US claimed that there are weapons of mass destruction there, but none were ever discovered. On an unrelated note, President Trump might be attempting to categorize fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, so please, stay on the lookout for crony justifications for conflict. I believe that if the US invasion of Iraq happened in the modern day, it would be far more scrutinized. So, not so fun fact, when I wrote this part of the video, the recent bombing of Yemen by the US hasn't happened yet, and now we can see the backlash in real time. The reason as to why such ubiquitous control of information and the mainstream narrative is not possible anymore is because of the internet, and something called public or citizen journalism. Because so many people are able to produce video evidence of any given event and post it instantly on the web, it has enabled us to be the closest to the truth we have ever been. And dissidents of the mainstream media narrative now have access to spaces where they can discuss alternate theories on major events and deduce whether the government is lying to them again, or if their actions are justified. Now, I love public journalism, and I think you should always prioritize it over a paid journalist, for example, or anybody who could have an agenda. I also love the fact that there are more spaces for honest discussions, without propagandists being actively involved in the discussion. But sadly, propagandists have adapted to this new reality. Instead of controlling the narrative through owning media institutions, assassinating every independent journalist you come across, and sending in your own people to make an extremely biased report of any given story, these are some of the methods they use that are compatible with the internet. And don't forget, while individuals who are responsible for pushing certain narratives have adapted their strategies, they still use the old ones all the same. Alright, here's some very common propaganda tactics you absolutely need to look out for. Number 1. Division propaganda. The good old reliable divide and conquer strat. This type of propaganda aims to push the narrative of division, to incite an us versus them mentality, and to make rebellious groups far weaker through fragmentation. Whenever you see any post trying to divide you from our fellowship, ignore it. The ruling class wants to squash any possible opposition that may arise, and it's much easier to deal with small groups of people than one large collective. Any Democrat versus Republican post, girls versus boys gender war, black versus white, this type of content is pure divisive brain rot if you think about it. Because yes, we might have our differences, but what matters is the contents of our characters, and the actions we take as human beings, instead of our ethnicity, sex, or nationality. That's why we must stay strong, ape strong together. Remember that the majority of us want better lives and living conditions for everyone, and for every deranged lunatic you see online, there are at least 10 mothers and fathers just trying to feed their family. Yes, evil people exist, cheaters, criminals, and the depraved, but thankfully, they are in the minority. We need to focus on coming together as a majority instead of constantly picking fights with the next social outrage companies like BlackRock want to push on you. More on that later. Number 2. Unification propaganda. Well, this is awkward. Did I just try to indoctrinate you? Well, that's up for you to decide, because you're a free thinker. But anyway, almost paradoxically to what I said previously, there is also propaganda that revolves around unification. Although we're not talking about the unification of workers and the common folk, no. The unification under one identity. Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer. This type of propaganda is often used by nationalists and fascists to unite the general population for a single cause. That being most commonly, a sacred war. It's the us versus them mentality again. But, usually unification propaganda also aims to prove that your people and your culture are superior to everyone else's, and that your culture must be spread throughout the entire world, no matter the cost and no matter how many lives are lost. Now, I know this is going to be a very tricky topic to talk about since most of my audience is American, but there's no other way to say this other than many of the American people have been completely bamboozled by their own government. To believe that you are the greatest country on earth may sound very patriotic, but let me explain how a belief like that is inherently dangerous. And this goes for all countries and cultures who preach about their cultural superiority, of course. While it is true that some cultures are superior to others, for example, almost every culture on Earth was and still is superior to Nazi Germany. Yes, including cannibalistic societies. But due to a massive propaganda campaign by Goebbels and co., many Germans believed to be superior to everyone, even if this wasn't the truth. To believe that your culture and people are superior to others leads to a much easier justification for imperialism, war, and quote-unquote, spreading civilized societies across the world. The US has been absolutely infamous for using democracy and the American way to justify the many atrocities they have committed across the globe, especially in the Middle East. So even if some aspects of foreign culture are superior or inferior to your own, we have to accept the fact that there is no perfect culture or group of people, and the only way we will achieve peace on this planet is if we figure out how to settle our differences without the use of violence and extreme force. If every major culture and nation on Earth were convinced of their own absolute superiority and they were willing to die for it, then the human chapter of history would be over very soon, because said cultures have nuclear weapons now. Besides, are you really liberating the people of Afghanistan if you're bombing their cities and making them bite the grass in a desert country? The answer is no, that's how you make someone hate you. The US was almost never the knight in shining armor for democracy and freedom, as they like to portray themselves as. They overthrew multiple democratically elected leaders, for example, the Pinochet junta. The true reason for most of their military operations and self-proclaimed wars on terror are resources and financial gain. Granted, that is the reason for the vast majority of empires. Ensuring that the US dollar is the main currency for petrol, and stealing massive amounts of gold from their military operations. No matter which country you're from, we should be categorically against war, because let's be real here, all of us are tired of fighting wars for old rich men. A lot of countries, especially across the West, are considering bringing back mandatory military service, but please remember that war is hell, and there will be no winners if another world war occurs. That was a bit of a tangent, but it leads us nicely to our third point, information overload. So, what do you do if the truth of the matter can easily be accessed by the general populace? You obfuscate the truth by intentionally putting massive amounts of false information out there to delegitimize the truth and make it harder to find. AI has greatly accelerated the process of putting massive amounts of false information into the world that clog the search engines with BS. And to me, it's no surprise that AI has been pushed so heavily by so many shady individuals, because not only can they profit off of your information from it, they control it, for the most part. This strategy of mass disinformation spreading is, in my opinion, much more annoying than simply censoring the truth outright. Because at least that way you can deduce what is true by looking at which specific parts are highly censored. But with this new method, even if you 100% have the true information on the matter, the massive amounts of opposing claims can be very overwhelming and make you doubt the truth. And lastly, this isn't propaganda by itself, but it's used to control the narrative: distraction. This is probably the easiest one to understand, but nonetheless extremely effective. This type of propaganda will blow small but controversial issues out of proportion to distract you from far more glaring ones, or they will give you bread and a circus, so to speak, so you'll never revolt. Oh, look over there! Non-binary keys are jingling right next to the Mega Death Factory 9000! Go and get them! So your instinct is to assume that you are not affected that much by propaganda, and it's only natural for humans to think this way. Because the trick of propaganda isn't to tell you what to believe, but to show a false depiction of reality and make you think that it's real. It's infinitely harder to convince a person that their entire worldview is incorrect, rather than just one piece of information. Effective propaganda aims to feed the target audience a narrative over time and let it compound in their respective communities. It's almost like a cult. I think a great example for the end goal of propaganda as media is how flat earthers behave. You can give them concrete evidence of the world being round, going back thousands of years. You can show them verified pictures. Heck, you can even explain the physics and math behind why the Earth has to be round. But they will claim that everything you have showed them is falsified information paid for by the shadow government. And I'm just a Mossad agent trying to get them off their track because they're too close to finding the ice wall. Of course, flat Earth is rather silly, and there are very few flat earthers in the world. But the tragedy is that these types of people are actually far more common. But their flat earth lies in their political or general beliefs about the world. 20 years ago, the difference between the quote-unquote left and the right side of the political spectrum revolved around their methodology for achieving their shared goal of living better lives. They agreed on basic facts of reality, but they disagreed on how they should be dealt with. We have now reached a point where people on the right and the left don't agree with basic facts of reality anymore, and it's gotten so bad, these people are actively in the government. I mean, seriously, making every American female by definition because you don't understand human biology is South Park levels of insanity. The fact that the left and the right see each other as enemies is absolute insanity as well, especially in countries who have democracies. There's supposed to be compromises, but lately, politicians in the West tend to heavily ignore one side and hyper-focus on just one aspect. Heck, in a lot of countries, their leaders ignore the demands of their people entirely. But is it really a democracy if one side has to suffer massively because of the other one being in power? But back to the whole all Americans are women now, the only reason it was phrased like this in the first place is because Trump and co wanted to end the woke debate around gender once and for all. But I hope you figured out by now that the whole gender issue and identity politics was actually propaganda for the right and the left. The Republicans used it as an example of moral outrage and degeneracy that needs to be outlawed, while the Democrats used it to garner more sympathy for their causes, without actually solving any of the issues. I'd like to remind you that they were in charge before Trump, and they could have introduced legislation to protect women's reproductive rights, and trans people for example, but they didn't. The Republicans and the Democrats are two sides of the same coin. Sure, one might be more liberal and one might be more conservative, but both of them massively support the military-industrial complex and American imperialism. So, when you're assessing a person's intentions, you should not trust their words, but their actions. Words are purely promises and theories until they're acted upon, and analyzing the actions of an individual and the following results caused by said actions reveals their true intentions. While the Republicans were cheering on as they finally defeat the woke, and the Democrats facepalm all over the place, the ruling class laughs as they steal more money from the American people once again, and give lots and lots of it to Israel. Clearly, the interest of the American people is largely irrelevant to them, because not giving money to Israel is something that both the right and the left mostly agree on. And realistically, the types of identity politics being discussed and paraded around are completely irrelevant when compared to the bigger picture, because in essence, we're all human at our core, and our actions define us as people, not our identities. Of course our identities matter, but they absolutely shouldn't be a focal point at every single discussion, and the topic is completely overblown in the media to sow division among the common folk and make them hate each other. So, as you know, fundamentally both the left and the right have the same goals, to live better lives and make life better for themselves and their community. Without us, the power structure that controls us also falls apart, and they know this, so what do? They show intentionally divisive topics in media to make you hate your fellow brethren. I have nothing against trans people, for example, but their existence just happens to be divisive. So the CIA looked at that and was like, what if we kept bringing this up as a major issue for the 21st century, even though transgender people account for less than 0.1% of the global population? And they did exactly that, and it's working as intended. No matter what your stance on the topic is, it's going to get hate from one side. I've legit seen Agent Smith levels of response at the mere mention of a trans person. Genuinely, so much about their sheer existence is controversial. I feel bad for them. But it makes sense, since frankly, the topic of trans children, for example, is genuinely explosive, with both sides assuming you are monsters for disagreeing with them. And here's the key word, monsters. From their respective points of view, the actions to save a trans person are polar opposites, and this polarity is the desired outcome. They don't even see each other as people anymore. The more you dehumanize your enemy, the easier it is for you to commit atrocities against them. This is also why a lot of propagandists love to use caricatures instead of people. Because any amount of nuance brings doubt into the equation, and most radical views can function if these strawmen turn out to be entirely imaginary, and real people are much more varied and have layers to them, like onions. Of course the internet also loves to highlight the extremes, but the extremes are not representative of the situation as a whole. I believe that the biggest divide we have in our society is that 1% of the population controls as much money as the bottom 50%. Clearly there's something extremely wrong here, but oh no, let's attack these other minority groups instead who have committed the grave sin of having slightly more melanin in their skin. I know this is gonna lead to people accusing me of being a communist or a conspiracy theorist, but first of all, I don't really care. And secondly, if you search for the truth of why our lives are more difficult than they need to be, and why these pointless wars keep being waged, you come across a very specific group of insanely wealthy individuals who are behind it all. Elon Musk, for example, doesn't even hide it. He outright supported the far-right German political party AfD before the elections took place, and his platform, Twitter X, has been used by members of the AfD to spread blatant misinformation about history, for example, calling Hitler a communist. If the 1% benefits from a political party, they will support it as much as possible, and because they have so much money, their influence is so much stronger than that of the average person. And sadly, most politicians have a price. That's how they make money, through very generous donations for the most part. You might argue that not all politicians can just be bought out, but sadly, the ones that can't be bought are usually assassinated. So we've entered a period of time where most of our leaders can't be trusted because they've been bought. Companies, corporations, and the government itself are all subjugating us to greater suffering, to their benefit, and we have tried countless peaceful protests before, and they have not worked. There is undeniably massive corruption within our system of governance across the world. It seems to me we are left with only one option, which I hope you figured out by now. To see through propaganda, try to see what someone would gain from you believing in something. And it doesn't just have to be financial benefits, since power-hungry people are real, so yes, even literal billionaires who have all the money they would ever need in life stand to gain more influence and more power, because they can never ever have enough. Usually, when you see falsified information on something you know a lot about, you don't even consider that this could be reality for a second. But if a lie fits exactly with your belief system, you might just let it slide. Humans are naturally biased creatures, and you have to actively recognize the fact that you have these biases to be able to act more rationally and truthfully. Once you know and understand your own biases, you can quickly tell when they come in effect and effectively stop them. It's not an easy task to be aware of your own biases, but it's the only way. But even if you're a hyper-based truth seeker who laughs at the mere indication of propaganda, the average person is still very vulnerable to it. So vulnerable, in fact, that they accept it as part of their reality and start spreading the very same propaganda that has been instilled into them. I like to call this effect propaganda by osmosis. This is, in my opinion, the most dangerous form of propaganda, because it gets accepted by the mainstream collective consciousness. If you call someone a pig 10 times, they might just on the 11th time. And now imagine hundreds of people who have all been led astray from the truth, attacking and harassing people trying to get to the bottom of it. You may have heard of the 100 to 1 rule, that for every one dissident against the common consensus, there should be 100 people to bring them down and put them back in their place. I've seen this happen many times before, and this is why it is so extremely difficult to reveal the truth to the average person. Besides, a lot of people tend to follow a trend or a belief because it's popular to do so. Most people just want to fit in, and being someone who forms their own opinions from scratch and varied sources of information is really difficult compared to simply submitting yourself to the collective consciousness. All the while, there are shady figures in the shadows spending billions of dollars to convince the public of something and keep control of the narrative. A proven example of this is when big sugar companies bought off scientists to say that fat was the reason people were getting fat and not sugar. This turned into common knowledge until it was finally disproven, but God knows how many people died due to obesity-related causes, because the sugar industry prioritized profits over the general health of the population. There were so many people who even tried to be health conscious by buying more lean products with less fat or zero fat, but it was mostly for nothing. In fact, some zero fat products substituted the fat for preservatives like sugar and salt, so it was probably more harmful than the regular version of it. Now, surely such an egregious example of corporate greed could only happen in the 50s, right? I'm sorry to say, but I believe this hasn't changed, even with the internet providing information to everyone. Because the quantity of information keeps increasing exponentially, but the quality has actually been decreasing due to things such as generative AI degeneration. Reliable sources are eroding as we speak, and the average person simply does not fact-check every piece of information they receive. Because of course they wouldn't, it's too much of a hassle, but that's how propaganda gets you. Not through a single poster convincing you to throw your life away for the sake of oil companies, but through countless Save Europe edits until you join the army and realize there is no My Little Dark Age playing in the background. Memes aren't safe anymore. There's a whole department about them in the Psychological Operations Division, so even though they're disguised as silly jokes, they can still be very effective psyops. Even YouTube videos aren't safe. Actually, quite the opposite. A lot of videos and analyses I've seen on YouTube actually turn out to be personal opinions disguised as facts. And this is extra manipulative to me because YouTubers are generally more perceived as friends rather than strangers. It's like, hey, your buddy Kyle is just ranting about Israel again and how it should get a full $1 trillion donation ASAP. Because he talks fast and in an expert manner, you assume that he must know a lot about the topic. And it's true. He knows so much about what he believes to be the truth, or what he's getting paid to say, but it's all fake. For example, did you know all cows speak Swahili? You don't think like a cow and you can't speak Swahili, so I'm probably right, and why should I lie, right? What incentive do I have to lie? Even more money? No, surely. There's a limit to my greed. Trust me, bro. And adding to the influencer epidemic are the robots, the clankers. Internet bots and botnets have made it almost impossible to have a civil discussion online. The best example I've seen for this is Reddit. Whenever you go on a subreddit that has a high chance of Fed presence like r/UFOs and conspiracy for example, you'll find lots of weak old Reddit accounts that do nothing but post on these subreddits to deny the notion of the original poster. Or what was really insane for me to witness was thousands of these suspicious accounts popping up out of nowhere on the UFO subreddit when the drones were flying over New Jersey. And I would see posts of extremely obvious airplanes and dark lighting being on the front page of the subreddit. They gained traction at an unnatural momentum, and this was most likely caused by bots mass upvoting them to discredit the UFO community as a bunch of lunatics, as they have always done. It is an open secret that various governments around the world are using bots and disinformation agents to sway the opinion of people online, but I think the average person does not realize the extent of their influence. If you're a long-time viewer of my channel, you may have noticed that my most popular videos have Gen Z in the title. And of course I know what I'm doing, but trust me, this goes deeper than me trying to use lucrative keywords and niches to get my videos seen more. Most of my Gen Z videos have comments that are completely unrelated to the video itself, almost as if they didn't watch the video, but just commented based on the title of it. Now, I can't outright prove this, but I highly suspect that there are thousands of bots out there scanning through Gen Z related content so they can sway their public opinion. And I realized these bots also boost my videos, and now I'm in this messed up situation where I'm writing down keywords and phrases for bots and algorithms just so people will be able to watch my videos. I'm not super happy about it myself. I would love to use way more creative titles that appeal to humans and not algorithms, but the reality is, I have to play the algorithm game. All YouTubers do, but now that I mentioned this term, YouTuber, does it even mean anything? I'm just a person posting YouTube videos. You have no idea whether I really am just a single person, or if I have a team behind me that tries to push a certain narrative. Or am I trying to bait people by using distraction propaganda as the bait? The knowledge of how to make effective propaganda is widely accessible now. Anyone can do it. It has played a large role in elections, to the point where emotionally charged propaganda material is causing people to vote based on their emotions instead of rationale. Due to the internet's polarization, people tend to shift towards their chosen beliefs more due to confirmation biases, thus resulting in a more radical stance. Peer pressure and group thinking. The majority of people can still be wrong about something. For example, when Galileo claimed the Earth revolved around the sun, he was ridiculed and even forced to retract his statement. If you are dead set in your beliefs, you will apply them to everything. I even noticed this in my videos, that certain men will unironically blame women for all of their problems, even though it's the opposite of what I was saying. And even if I'm critical of women, and say that they are part of the problem, that's not enough for someone that's been radicalized. They need to hear that they are the sole reason for the problem. Content creators are incentivized to pander to their audience for greater loyalty and viewer retention. And let me tell you, I know how easy it is to manipulate vulnerable men, appeal to their desires, say that it's not their fault. There's a very easy solution of just becoming a high value man, and then you'll finally be happy. But I try not to, even when I know that if I don't do it, someone else will take the opportunity to do so. And this is why it's so difficult to remain honest and moral as a content creator. You know for a fact there's a sea of grifters waiting in line for such an opportunity. And most people also don't really want to hear the truth, if I'm honest. They want to hear what they believe to be the truth. Because of things being less than great right now, more people tend to be depressed or frightened. And fear is one of the best methods for manipulation. And there's lots of ways to spread that fear. Even the phrasing of sentences can contain propagandistic messages. A good example would be in Nazi Germany, where even math lessons revolved around how many Jews do you have to chase away to achieve peace. You can always choose to highlight information or withhold it on purpose. For example, a person has attacked another person with a sword in London. You can turn this into Indian immigrant attacks British man with a sword in cold blood. You can keep adding information like religion, personal beliefs, eye color, how well they can hit the whip and nay-nay. But ultimately, highlighting certain aspects of a person can increase the hatred towards the group of which the person belonged to, even if the individual was a crazed lunatic. I have seen too many videos online now where some clearly mentally ill insane man or woman runs around with a weapon and behaving irrationally, just for the discourse to devolve into why I hate insert race, or why this culture leads to violence. Fact is, no matter what culture, ethnicity, or religion, you can always be a crazy mofo who wants to commit acts of violence. All humans have the capacity to be evil and terrible people. Correlation does not equal causation, and of course confirmation bias once again. Humans are almost infinitely divisible. If we concern ourselves with irrelevant features like the color of our skin, we'll never get anywhere. To be fair, bots are starting to fire a lot of the time, but nonetheless. We also have to remind ourselves not to stoop down to their level. If they're using misleading videos about a specific group of people to insult their appearance and behavior, it would be unwise in my opinion to then make fun of the appearance of the poster and their culture. Because they're well versed in the game of racism, it will be very difficult to out-racist them. And stooping down to this level of ad hominem attacks will just perpetuate the core issue instead of solving it. We need less racism overall, you get me? So if you see a person online being hateful and spreading misinformation, insult their character, like the fact that by thinking like this they're achieving nothing in life, and that even a person with 6th grade education has a better understanding of statistics than them. It's also really easy to debunk most of their claims, and when you start doing some Socratic questioning, they'll talk themselves into a hole. Because believing a lie requires making a mistake in your chain of logic. Always go for the weakest link to expose these hypocrites. And as a fundamental axiom on the internet, don't believe what you see on here immediately. Another very sneaky tactic I've seen being used to alter the narrative is the simplification of information. The truth can be simple, but it is often pretty complicated as a matter of fact. Even the simplest things, like for example why 1 + 1 = 2, are in practice very difficult to prove. I could say that it's just the way it is. If you add one unit to another, the result will be 2. And that's not incorrect. But I'm still withholding information by only telling you the truth partially. Our world is not nearly as black, white, and polarized as the media makes it out to be. So stay on the lookout for simple phrases like oil and water don't mix. It's a true statement, but people are thankfully not made out of oil. We're all mostly water. You may have noticed that there's been an uptick in far-right movements all across the world and nods to ideologies like Nazism shown by Elon Musk that are as subtle as a rooster with axes for wings. These types of ideologies are on the rise. And to me, it's no surprise, because we're still the same people who lived in the 1930s and 40s. Mr. Joe Gobbler was really good at making propaganda, especially one that is targeted towards young lonely men who have to prove and justify their existence. So like an old landmine, the propaganda from back then is still just as effective as ever. In the internet, a ton of things are generalized, which can already get quite icky because the world has a tendency to prove us wrong at the most inopportune times. Of course you need some amount of generalization to be able to determine general patterns quicker, however, this can easily lead to overgeneralization, or the hasty generalization fallacy. To get you to believe in something radical and insane, they might just play it off as jokes, like, these types of people suck more than the government sucks Israel's toes, am I right? They're also stinky as well, and their culture is vastly inferior to our culture. As you can see, I've depicted myself as the Chad, and them as the Chud. You know, what if the world would be better off if we nuked them? They seem to cause all of our problems. Wouldn't that be funny? Just look at what the nukes did to Japan. Maybe they'll become kawaii too. And during the entire pipeline, if you question their intentions, they will claim that they were just joking, and that you have no sense of humor. Schrodinger's douchebag propaganda, that's what the world has come to. But it's real, and it's effective. And it's historically been always easy to convince someone that all of their problems in life are caused by a certain group of people, but for some strange reason, they are never actually the ones in charge of ruining your life. You might have noticed that the Nazis used very similar tactics, and it's true. Fascists and Nazis in particular love pushing boundaries to see how far they can go. That's why you've been seeing the recent Roman salutes on video, and jokes, if you can call them that, about the white race. Which doesn't exist, by the way. So-called white people are very ethnically diverse, yet they try to brainwash people into thinking it's one homogeneous race and how it's better than everything else. Influencers have that name for a reason, even though I hate the term. They do have a large influence over a large group of people. I would say that they use subliminal messaging, but it's become way too obvious to call it that. And we know for a fact that various governments pay them to push certain narratives because allegedly, various right-wing influencers were paid by a quote-unquote covert Russian operation to push certain talking points. Or when it was discovered that the YouTuber Johnny Harris is funded by a think tank that promotes what I like to call CIA talking points. This is probably much larger and much more common than we realize, so I urge you to take information with a grain of salt. They are not your friends, and they don't even know about you. But that was a very direct example of paid propaganda funded by various governments. I think a lot of influencers or content creators on the internet aren't paid for spreading propaganda. Rather, their sources and opinions are heavily influenced by the mainstream media, and they simply parrot information they found on the topic through a quick Google search. Now, whenever I say do your own research, I know that your alarm bells may be ringing, because it's a common tactic used by right-wing groups to spread their agenda. They pose themselves as an alternative to mainstream media, even though they are just as mainstream and just as riddled with lies and propaganda as the traditional media they claim to replace. The best way I found to counteract this grift is by having as many varied media sources as possible. You know the saying, a broken clock is right twice a day. Now imagine you have an assortment of broken clocks, each broken differently, and now you can be much closer to the truth, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find the coveted working clock. But keep in mind, if you're purely choosing to go off statistics, they're not safe. You can misrepresent statistics very heavily, and the interpretation of statistics is crucial to their meaning. What I've noticed between these various different media platforms is that they focus on very different aspects of a story. For example, on the topic of immigration, one side will show the positive sides of it, and the other side the negative, and both can be true at the same time. I know, insane concept, am I right? But you can very easily dictate the narrative by only focusing on certain aspects of a whole story, also known as selection bias. Oftentimes you will see videos online of certain groups of people behaving terribly or saying terrible things. The most common one I've seen is random TikTok street interviewers going up to women and asking them leading questions to milk as much engagement bait from the answer as they possibly can. They either go to clubs where you are way more likely to find women who live a more promiscuous lifestyle, or they will hire OnlyFans models to act stupid on camera. Or they'll take their words massively out of context, and this type of content has been disproven again and again. Even if it's so painfully obvious that these videos don't mirror reality in any way, yet incels, for example, use these videos as gospel to demonstrate how evil women are. But of course, most people believe what they want to believe instead of trying to find the objective truth of the matter, so it's no surprise. A lot of ideas are not spread because they're good, but because people like them. And this kind of thinking has held us back so much, I don't even want to think about it, because frankly, it's just plain depressing. If we could objectively talk about our issues in life while understanding that our emotions are an indication of how we feel internally about the topic, while recognizing that our emotions don't necessarily align with reality, we'd be a super space civilization right now. But what I'm really worried about is how internet propaganda in its many forms is affecting the curious minds of young teens and children, Gen Z included. They are infamously very gullible, and false evidence is extremely effective on them. Too many times I have had to witness literal children want to hunt all furries to extinction, believe that women are property, hating what they call basketball people, and basically just hating everything that even slightly deviates from the established norm they have been brainwashed into believing. This is why you don't give kids unrestricted access to the internet, because suddenly, little Timmy's doing a very peculiar salute he saw the Tesla man do. And for some reason, little Timmy really wants to save Europe, despite having no relations to Europe whatsoever. But the good news is, children believe in dumb stuff all the time, and because of their heightened neuroplasticity, it's much easier to explain to them why certain beliefs are so dangerous, and why we should try to live together in harmony, instead of constantly attacking each other for the smallest differences. The bad news, on the other hand, is that adults are much harder to convince when they are in the wrong, and their previous life experience doesn't necessarily make them wiser. It makes them a lot more susceptible to confirmation bias. Because of the nature of internet algorithms, it shows you things you are most likely to watch and interact with, and yada yada, echo chamber, you already know this. But let's get to the issue of who is behind all of this mass propaganda that's everywhere. I hope you realize by now that the American Empire has been one of the most prolific producers of propaganda, probably of all time, having the most soft power out of the major global powers. A lot of the psychological operations we're aware of, like MKUltra, were made in the USA. They have Hollywood, the internet itself is American-centric, and BlackRock, which is responsible for forcing diversity into everything. And I'm not even kidding. Here's CEO Larry Fink talking about how they force diversity.
For you.
Well, behaviors are going to have to change, and this is one thing we're asking companies. You have to force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors. 54% of the incoming class are women. We added 4 more points in terms of diverse employment this year, and what we're doing internally is if you don't achieve these levels of impact, your compensation could be impacted. Okay,
we're doing the same thing.
And so it's just you have to force behaviors, and if you don't force behaviors, whether it's gender or race or just any way you want to say the composition of your team, you're going to be impacted, and that's not recruiting, it is development, as Ken said. And ultimately, it's still going to take time, but I am just as much shocked as Ken is that we have not seen more opportunities, and we're going to have to force change.
If you really want to get down to it, Vanguard and BlackRock are probably directly responsible for the narratives you see being pushed in the media. They basically own everything, at least in part because of their shares. And because they're such massive shareholders, they get to dictate a ridiculous amount of things. They are major investment firms who probably fund the majority of things you use in your day-to-day life. Honestly, this is such a huge rabbit hole that I would recommend checking it out on your own, because if I were to talk about this at length, it would probably take me hours. But yeah. Whether you think the current state of diversity in media is good or not, it is objectively true that this behavior is partially being forced upon the employees and us, the consumers. They use MSCI ESG scores to determine whether to pull out their shares or invest in the first place, and the scores are judged various factors, but it boils down to the values they want to see, allegedly. Mind you, the general population gets no say in this. They are directly impacting the media you consume with their ridiculous amount of wealth. And in no way do people like this actually care about representing marginalized people. For example, a recent Oscar-winning movie, Emilia Perez, did such a poor and terrible portrayal of a Mexican trans person, it united trans people, transphobes, and Mexicans alike to review bomb the movie. It is actually probably one of the worst movies ever made, at least in my opinion, yet it won an Oscar. Surely it's not because the movie is good, but because Hollywood is rigged and they care more about their own personal agendas than they care about art. It's because I think Hollywood is trying to push a message onto you. They want you to hate trans people. They want you to hate Mexican people, while the filthy rich keep getting richer. All of this constant outrage about the woke mind virus. Do you think these companies don't realize that making every single protagonist a person of color and queer, even when this makes absolutely zero sense contextually and historically, don't know what they're doing? Remember, look at the outcomes of their actions. If you are practicing this rhetoric of being quote-unquote anti-woke, you are falling right into their trap. They want you to be mad and more divided. They're using reverse psychology. When you actually talk to the minorities that are being represented, they hate that crap too. It's not like there wasn't diversity in media before and everybody's just super duper racist now. At least I hope the world didn't become more racist for no reason. It is because this behavior is forced. Disney's blatant race swapping, the US military ad with a woman who has 2 lesbian moms. It's all brought to you and sponsored by BlackRock and Vanguard. Allegedly. It's all a game to these people. They're neither woke in the traditional sense, which was hijacked completely by the way, nor conservative. Their god is money, and that's all they worship. Well, and they do worship the idol of a big owl in Bohemian Grove, where some of the world's richest and most powerful people gather to practice paganism and participate in orgies that some have claimed are more akin to Diddy parties. I encourage you to fact check me, Bohemian Grove is real. Nonetheless, here are some ways you can fight off the onslaught of propaganda we now experience on a daily basis. The easiest solution is to just remove yourself from the internet as much as possible, although the TV isn't much better when it comes to this. Actually click on the article that claims to be supporting a fact instead of just blindly believing every factoid you see. Try to look at both perspectives and opposing sides of conflicts. Know your history. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it again. If you know your history, then it's easier to see these tactics being used on you. I've mentioned Joseph Goebbels in here before, and I would honestly recommend doing research on the ways he manipulated the German people. Write down important events so they can't be falsified. The people in power have a tendency to burn books as we've seen previously, but now instead of burning books, they can just change websites to alter history in the way they want. So archive crucial information if possible, and do not let yourself be deceived by their gaslighting. But don't forget, history is written by the winners, and they have altered history numerous times before, but I hope that with the information age, we can archive both sides of the story. The government doesn't even have to be involved. If you look at the Wikipedia entry for Caesar salad, for example, there's been an info war going on about who actually invented it. Or just anything related to Turkey and Greece. They love falsifying information about each other online all the time. This is also why Wikipedia, despite being very trustworthy a lot of the time, is not considered an academic source. We should always strive to look for the truth, in my opinion, and if you exclusively listen to only one side of things, you'll be hard-pressed to find it. I hope we can all agree that following an ideology or a movement to such an extent where you will distort reality to fit the narrative is dangerous and idiotic. The majority of popularized conspiracy theories are just confirmation bias. If you go out looking for red, you'll start seeing a lot of red. Although not every conspiracy theory is kooky and crazy. A lot of them have merit, and 3-letter agencies love dismissing legitimate concerns as conspiracy theories. Don't let your emotions control you, and separate yourself from your ideologies. Don't let them start to define you. You have to remind yourself that you are an individual, and these beliefs and interests are meant to serve you, the person, not the other way around. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you very much for my amazing patrons for your continued support. This video was difficult to make to say the least. I tried to remove my own biases as much as I could in the hopes that we could unite over this. And if you want to stick it to the feds, you can join my Discord server with the link in the description below. Oh, and like and subscribe, I guess.